Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the March 8th, 2023 meeting of the Northborough Appropriations Committee. First on the agenda tonight is the approval of minutes from the February 22nd, 2023 meeting. Do I have a motion?
Move to accept.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Not seeing any. All those in favor? Any opposed? Minutes approved. Second on the agenda tonight is the Assabet Valley Regional Technical High School Fiscal Year 2024 Budget Presentation. The floor is yours.
Excellent. Talk really loud so I'm gonna move that away from me.
John.
And that's in your
This is part of my, that's part of my test.
Chief, you couldn't taser this thing or something?
Talking loud would have nothing to do with being an educator, would it?
Probably because of my background. I'm a welder by trade. So when all that equipment's humming and on, you have to kind of talk about the equipment. All right, well, good evening. Thank you very much. It's always an honor to be before you. We, as we do annually, we like to come and thank this committee as well as John for his leadership here in Northborough. We'd like to recognize our esteemed school committee representative from Northborough and chair of our school committee, Virginia Sims George. And we're always appreciative of the support that we've seen throughout the years from the community of Northborough in supporting their students who choose career and technical education and decide to come to Assabet. Tonight we're going to provide for you a FY24 budget. And I think what we'll be showing you is some of the things that have come to fruition that I've spoken about over the past several years. And mainly that we've talked about, we've started to see an increase of in-district students coming into our school from our member towns. And with that, it tends to push our out-of-district students out of the picture, or out of the revenue source that we've been able to use over the past years. So you'll see that reflected in this year's budget, and it's a little astonishing, to be honest with you, but it's not an unknown fact, unfortunately. And I think we've got several things that are happening, but hopefully we can explain it to you and bring you some understanding, as well as educate you on the process. So I've actually made sure we put information on the bottom of the slide. So I'm on the introduction slide, and then we've numbered each slide so that way you know exactly where we are. We have learned something over the years. But just quickly, so for Assabet, this budget was built based on a revenue plan of what Assabet will be receiving with several funding sources that are required when we talk about net school spending. And what net school spending is basically what we need to spend per pupil for every student that comes in to the school district. And we'll show you that slide a little bit later on, but as of October 1, our funding is always based on the previous school year, right, on the October 1 number. So you'll see that this past October 1, 2022, we realized an increase of 61 students from our in-district communities, which means that basically in our freshman class that we accepted of 300, in the past we've accepted 200 in-district kids and 100 out-of-district kids. In this year's freshman class, we only have 10 out-of-district kids. Okay, so it's a huge pendulum swing from what we've experienced in the past. The other component is that you will see on the next bullet down, it says, so the overall increase in student enrollment went up 6.4%, all right, for our in-district student population. The next bullet down is our Chapter 70 funding aid, which is this big, long formula, and which I believe John may have sent you the electronic version, so the highlighted blue links down at the bottom of that slide, if you wanted to get more in depth on how these things are determined, you can take a look at that. But our increase in Chapter 70 funding aid, with the increase of our student population going from 910 students the year prior to 971, and coupled with that, the student per pupil expenditure from the governor's House 1 budget had realized an increase of 9.6% on the student expenditure piece. So those two things coupled created a 21.6% increase on how much funding we're getting through Chapter 70, which is through the government, right, through the state. The 7.9% increase that you see there is the minimum local contribution, in which the state makes a determination based on the aggregate wealth model of your individual, of the 7 individual communities, and your ability to pay, that they've made a determination that the communities overall would have to split a $902,835 increase, right? So you got kind of 2 hits there. The nice thing is that regional transportation, that's something that we've always fought for. When the regional school districts were built in the state, and then actually for Massachusetts, they stated that when they were built, the carrot was basically they were going to provide 100% regional transportation, right? But they have 2 words that were added to that language, if appropriated, right? And they've never been at 100%. So this is the very first time, at least in my time in education, that it's ever been at 90. The highest we've ever seen it was at 80, but we've seen it as low as 60%. So with that percentage regional transportation rate, we're going to actually get an additional $99,197 to offset the additional regional transportation costs that basically get borne by you, okay? So right now, we have a budget, it's 1.2, we'll get through it. So basically, you folks, the state's providing funding for about 700,000 and some change, and the difference between that 700,000 and the 1.2 is borne by the communities, because that's one of the required minimums that communities have to pay for, okay? So we'll walk through that. So overall, we're seeing an increase of about $2.6 million in what we're seeing for net school spending. And we have a slide that kind of talks about that a little bit more. So that's just to give you a kind of a frame of mind of where and how we built the budget. So the next page, or page 1, are the topics that are listed that's in this presentation. I'm not going to read it to you. You can take a look, and you'll see some of these things we're going to breeze through rather quickly. And some of them are just explanatory as to what the method is. The next page, page 2, gives you a bit of an overview of what the budget looks like in a snapshot. So the $23,475,499 that you see is the operating budget. As an overall increase of $2.8 million, 811,815, which indicates a 12.5% increase to the operating budget, which is directly related to the 61 additional in-district students. Now, mind you, you're going to see when we look at Northborough's calculation, you didn't have any, you had no change in student. Actually, you had a reduction of 4 students. So you'll see that your calculation is going to decrease slightly, but I think because of some complicated other things that are happening tonight, it may go potentially, your realization is like a 1.5% increase to what your assessment is over last year, but because of this other vote that has to take place, it may bump it to 4, right, and some change. So I don't want to complicate it, but just to give you the heads up. And then the bottom piece of the capital budget is the 8th payment in the debt service, which was the renovation of the school that folks voted. It's a $55,000 increase from FY23, and we'll talk about it. You'll see as we move through the years That decreases $55,000 pretty much every year, and never goes up. It was a set rate, and it was based on a 3-year rolling average at the time of which the project was approved. There's more information in the packet that we can look at more closely. Questions so far? Okay. Page 3, budget drivers. One of the things that we're seeing, and I think I've come before you folks and talked about the number of students that vocational schools tend to get that require special education services. What we're seeing with our increased number of students, we're seeing more students that are English language learners, as well as students with a lower percentage of students that are attending Assabet. We're at about 25% this year. However, those students we're experiencing are requiring higher levels of services, okay? So that's one of our budget drivers, to meet also the demands increase with social, emotional learning, the mental health, and of course, the special ed services. We try and maintain appropriate class sizes. When you have a 25% special education population, we do not have any type of inclusion type, separate classes. All of our inclusion classes, their general ed classes, our special ed students are mixed in with our general ed students, and we generally will have co-taught classes to help those students that need additional services. And just as a side note, when those students go into their career tech fields, we do not limit those students as based on services. So in a career tech field that we're offering, you could have upwards to 60 to 70% students in that career tech field learning a career field in their 4 years. We have the increase in the interest in enrollment. We also have a very diverse program of studies that's offered. You know, several programs that require students to go on to college. Therefore, we offer AP classes as well as music classes. We try and emulate education of the whole child. One of the big budget drivers, obviously, is the inflationary costs that we've incurred. I'll give you a quick example that, you know, when our folks at any chance we can have our students do real-world experiential learning, whether it's in a community like we've done for Northborough in the past, or even in our school district, with switching out some of our, even though we had a renovation project, believe it or not, we have old lighting fixtures. They were not LED at the time because it was too brand new and it was too expensive. But as we swapped those out, we used those electrical students to work on a real life scenario. We used to be able to get an electrical quote that would last 30 days. And now it only is good for 10 hours because of the change in cost of copper and things of that nature. So we've seen supply costs to run these programs, which use consumables, which, you know, you can only weld on a piece of metal so long before you can grind it down, but for plumbing, you can only cut the pipe so short and then you can't use it anymore, and carpentry when it comes to wood. So we're seeing an increase in a lot of those costs of consumables and equipment. This also meets all contractual obligations and moves us closer to pre-COVID staffing and service levels. We still are in negotiations with our teachers union. We have not settled on a percentage for health insurance yet. We recently moved to from Fallon to Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare. So we were with them from July through the present, and they're waiting on another month to give us some claims data, and hopefully will get us in a favorable range. I believe in talking to John, he's kind of having the same situation
You
with.
heard from the
with those
superintendent from the Algonquin, same thing, waiting for their numbers, as is the town. We all got dropped by Fallon, we all went to Harvard Pilgrim, so kind of in the same boat.
Just quickly, so as I mentioned, back to staffing levels. The other budget driver, as I mentioned earlier, was obviously we're seeing decreasing amounts of revenue that we would collect from out-of-district tuition because of our increasing in-district enrollment. So staffing adjustments, we're looking to add a librarian and an elective instructor. Those were two positions that were cut prior to COVID, and we're looking to bring them back on. The staffing changes, we have a director of educational technology. that we originally had brought on for 2 years through the ESSER 2 grant funding. ESSER 3, thank you for the correction, as well as a school adjustment counselor. And those folks were put in for 2 and now have to be moved back into the budget. We have another English language individual that's on ESSER 3 that has 1 more year this year coming up, or FY '24 rather, and then that person will be needed to work into the budget. Questions so far? Yes, sir.
Yeah, you mentioned English language
Bob, can you
learning.
pull your microphone towards you so they can pick you up? Thank you.
You mentioned English language learning, increased numbers. Do we have an understanding of how much of an increase? I mean,
Off the top of my head, I
could be
do
a small number, it could be a big number. I
It's,
don't understand
well,
the
I think,
gravity of it.
yeah, at one point, we had probably, we had, I'm trying to think.
I mean, is it?
I just looked at the number.
Compared historically, how's it?
It's grown, so we have a very large Portuguese population in the Marlboro Hudson area. So we have been looking at recruiting more towards that population.
So what, you're hiring more teachers to teach those?
So we're hiring more ELD specialists that would work with those students, so when they're in their academic program, and then they also will work with that student when they're in their technical program.
So how many teachers about you're hiring?
Well, there's only one will be still on the grant. We had already had, an additional one,
So
and so I think we're close to 30, I think.
it brings me to that point about grants. I mean, can you apply for grants to mitigate
Oh, yeah.
some of the costs?
Yeah, we try, any potential chance we get when it comes to applying for grants, we'll take that opportunity. Obviously, with grants, it depends on the criteria that, what you can use the grant for. ESSER, they had a lot of, the criteria looked at technology, it looked at safety and health, it looked at social emotional, and it looked at students with EL, that were EL learners. So it was easy to fund that money directly to that type of stuff. But yeah, as we come, well, eventually, some grants, what happens is, you have funding where it's like Title I that potentially can be used to offset some costs, and it's specifically for that, but it's a very small amount of money. Other grants, you can start a program, say for in Perkins. Perkins is a funding mechanism that's for career technical schools. If we wanted to start, and we're not starting this, I'll just use an example. If we were to start a vet tech program, we could potentially write it into our Perkins local plan, and that tech instructor or a curriculum could be paid through the Perkins grant for a period of 3 years, but then has to be moved out of that program and picked up by the district.
All right, so just falling back a little bit, so is it a large number of kids, or is it?
I think at one time we were at like a 7 or 8, and we've gone up to around 25. I can get
Bless you.
actual numbers for you, yeah.
Okay. And what about the social emotional learning people? I mean, is that a big increase too? It sounds like it's just saying.
Well, so that, what we're seeing is, students that were in the district, and it's interesting, that always seemed to be an area in which students receiving special education services more fit into the category. Since the pandemic hit in the past couple of years, we've seen it even in the general education population. So we have, we're taking one off of a grant that was here, but we have 2 other school adjustment counselors, and then this third one that's on the grant.
I missed the Algonquin meeting. Is that comparable to what Algonquin was going through at regional?
In terms of English
Of the
language
increase,
learners,
the
or?
increase of the ELL and the SEL.
Not so much,
Not so
not so
much.
much. Again, it has to do with the demographics of your community.
Yeah.
So it is, we do have English language learners here, clearly, but they have 11 sending towns, 7 member towns, and so they have, from Marlboro, there are larger populations from some of their sending communities, so.
Is there a way to know what the cost increase was because of that? I mean, I was looking through and I couldn't see it here.
I missed
The cost increase because of these increases. I was just wondering what the percentage was, because you got a plan for these, and I was just wondering how much is this costing?
Overall for the 61 students?
Yeah, you have an increase of a budget here, right?
Yeah.
That you're saying that this is affected. I'm just wondering how much of that is part of that increase?
Right.
Is it a large amount?
She's gonna pull up a number for you.
Okay, I don't need to belabor it.
That's okay.
I just,
EL,
it concerns me, so.
over
Yeah.
how long a period?
Just
Like last
between the
year?
last period.
Um,
That's okay, you can get that to me later. I don't need to belabor this.
Okay, I'll
I'm
look at
just
it.
curious because it just seems like every year there's a big increase of this and so forth. I mean, how do you prepare for that? I mean, is it a costly thing, or maybe you guys don't think it's a costly thing? I can't tell
From
this.
my perspective, all I brought into the FY '24 budget, I'm Maria Silva, I'm the Director of Business
Yeah, we
Operations.
should have done
Sorry.
introductions.
I brought it in the ELD teacher. No, we brought it, is that the one that we brought back?
That's one thing, Grant.
Yeah, that's still in the grant. So from my perspective, in FY '24, there wasn't a huge increase in our operational budget for EL services. There was some for special ed, but not EL. In FY '25, I anticipate bringing that one ELD teacher, and along with the services that were provided for SEL
Okay,
services.
so we're only talking about one teacher. We're not talking about.
Yeah, no.
No.
One teacher.
The
I
other,
can tell from this. That's-
Okay, yeah.
the other component I will share too is, to help us with ELL, we've also purchased some software called Elevation, and it's spelled with ELL, Ovation, just like you would spell elevation, but with an extra L. And that's a software that can be used across the school district. All teachers can access, our career tech ed teachers, as well as our academic and special education teachers, so that as they're planning to educate these students that are ELL students, they have strategies within the software that they can use to help with that. So that's another factor that we're purchasing through ESSER 3, and has been on a 3-year process. So that will be coming out of the grant next school year, and will most likely roll into the budget in FY '25.
All right, thank you.
Yep. Page 5, any other questions? I know, page 5. This is what the enrollment changes look like across the district. As you can see, Northborough had a -4, which is a minus 5.88% compared to FY '23. And then, as I mentioned, the out-of-district students, you can see kind of where it drops off at the bottom of that chart. But there's our 7-member towns at the top, and you can see kind of where the students came from, so. Okay? Yeah. So the next few pages are just our method of assessment and what we use to calculate the budget, statutory method. Basically, it's the, Chapter 70. There's also the minimum local contribution. It also means that any additional costs for transportation, capital debt services, or capital costs that would be calculated into that school spending would be the responsibility of our sending districts. MLC, it just gets into a little bit more specific on page 7. Oh, yeah, question?
Yes.
On the, back on page 5 on the enrollment
Sure.
changes, you have Northborough students listed as 68 on 10/1/20, 2021. Is there a more recent enrollment figure?
Well, that's what the figure was for last October 1, 2021. It was 68 students. And then this past October 2022, there's only 64. So you reduced 4 students in your overall.
Got it.
That's just showing you the comparison of what it was the year prior.
Okay, so
For
October,
purposes of all of educational funding, the magic number, the date is October. That's that's the mark.
yep, and so that 64 is as of October 2022.
This year. Yep. So, yeah, so technically, we have 61 kids. Here's another issue with educational funding. We have 61 kids this year. However, we don't see the funding for those students until next year. So we're always lagging a year behind. So if this trend continues, we could have another 60 to 70 kids next year in district, and we'll be educating those kids based on the prior year's budget. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So page 8, again, it talks about minimum local contribution. The governor's budget was released on February 24, and that's when Marie went to town putting all the numbers together. I will say for the student per pupil expenditure, Maria estimated a 10% increase, and it actually came in at 9.6. So she did some pretty good projections to get us within 0.4% of what it would be overall. Page 9 is the minimum local contribution, which is, you can see up in the top left, it's the Chapter 70 summary. 801 is our LEA code, our educational code, that's to identify us. But this slide basically just walks you on how the numbers are derived. You can look on the left, it says the prior year aid, what the foundation aid is. If you go to right to comparison to 23, you'll actually see, sorry about the small numbers, but this is from the DESE website. You'll see from 23, if you look, it says the enrollment was at 910 last year, right? That's the October 1, 2021 number. And then it jumped to 971 with a change of 61 students. So you can see the percentage change over in that right-hand column as you walk down each of those levels. So what you can see is for required net school spending, we've actually had a percent increase of 13.32%. But the required net school spending of foundation for ASABIT is 100%, right? So it's never usually below 100 at a minimum. They require schools, they set what the requirement is or what the school needs to spend net school spending. Ours is at 100%. If you take a look at the next slide, and I never used to share this, but I used to talk about it, but this year I decided to share it with you. If you take a look, this is FY22 and FY23, and down in the blue, you'll see ASABIT's listed at 801. So we've had a couple of years where we were below our net school spending, and what happens with net school spending if you're below, they tack it onto the next year's budget. So you'll see that actual percent of net school spending for FY22, we were at 95.9, and we had a shortfall of $737,736. So our actual foundation, in order to meet that, would have been 112.9%. If you look at over in FY23, it changed by 10%, but we still have a shortfall of $473,934. Part of the issue is that ASABIT always builds a budget that's at 100% or 101, 102 points above net school spending. So if we run into any issues and there has to be cuts, right, we don't have, like for this budget, we have no ability to cut this budget because we would be below net school spending, right? If you look at the other vocational schools below us, you'll see that most of them are above net school spending by quite a bit. And then I just share with you on the top is the list of our sending communities and what they're spending, what their required net school spending is, which is the actual, and then their actual net school spending, what they're spending on education. So for Northborough, the state requires you to spend 170.9, but they spend 194.7. So the way, and I'm looking at FY22. So in 22, they were requiring that the community spend 17 million in some change, but the community actually spent 29 million on education. So it was well above. So if there were any types of cuts that needed to be made, it would be a lot easier to do. We don't operate our budget like that. Well, we haven't in the past 49 years. We're gonna be 50 next year at ASABIT, so. Yeah, well, September 23, we're turning 50. So that's just more of a resource for you to take a look at. Page 11, you'll see actually the minimum local contribution. So based on the numbers of students that you've had, down below, you'll see the FY '23, the 910 at the top. And if you get on to Northborough, which is 213, you'll see that they had 68 students. FY '24, it went to 64. The change is -4. You'll see what the FY '23 minimum local contribution of $1,143,066 was. And then for FY '24, even though you realize a slight reduction of $6,984, as your MLC will drop to $1,136,082. Questions? No questions? Oh, yeah, question.
Yeah, on one of your charts, you showed 11 towns listed on there, and the third largest town of students was a town called Others. I was just wondering what the breakdown, is that a town, or is that a breakdown of others?
So John mentioned the 7 member towns,
Right.
but we draw from 11. We actually draw from 20 towns. So 7 are our in-district member towns, and then we have another 13 that potentially are out of district. We potentially have 1 student from Boxborough, 1 student from Leominster, 1 student from Sudbury. So that's what that group of others
So
makes
the
up.
others, that's a pretty large others, though. That's the third largest group.
But it's only 1 or 2 folks from those other towns.
Right.
Yeah. So, but they're potentially, if you looked at it,
So what we got-
they were leaving, right?
Outside of those other 11 towns, there are 50 other students from singles from all over the state?
Yeah, or it could be more than 1 single, it could be 2, 3. A lot of times what happens is our students that are in district will potentially then move out of district, and then their community will then allow them to still stay at Aspen to finish out their high school career. That's what potentially happens. We don't get too many, the only transfers we get are generally, never usually in freshman year because we have no space. It would be potentially sophomore year, and on a rare occasion in junior year, but never in
Is
senior.
Assabet the only vocational school in the area that the whole state has to come to you?
No.
So I don't understand why all of a sudden now you got 50 other students. Well, all right.
Yeah, well, it depends on if a regional or Hope school doesn't have a particular program, the student has the opportunity to transfer to a school that does after freshman year. It wouldn't be allowed to happen during freshman year because of exploratory, unless it met a certain criteria. We had a student that was from one of our member towns, I won't mention which town. They wanted to go into a landscape management program. Assabet doesn't offer it, but Minuteman Tech does. That student was allowed to go to attend Minuteman. But if that's the only exception because it's an agricultural type program. So the only other exception is if a student wants to do a large animal science type career field or some type of agricultural, they can go to Norfolk Aggie, Essex Aggie. They don't have to go to Assabet first. They can actually, not that I want to publicize this, but they could go from Northborough, and then you'd have to pay tuition, and then whatever the busing is to get them to Essex Tech up in Danvers or Norfolk Aggie down in the south part of this. So we have, so others is, another 13 communities that could have a couple more. I mean, Shrewsbury has a larger number, but we list those. But that's what the others makes up.
71 students from others, okay. Yeah.
Yep. And those folks pay a tuition, but no other costs are associated with that. So that town has to pay the busing for that student, and we also assess them any kind of special education costs. Yep. So on page 12, if there's no more questions, what you can see is we have the breakdown of how our communities will be assessed. The very top that's in blue is the minimum local contribution. If you look over at Northborough, that minimum local contribution is basically in direct relation to the previous slide, right, that you had looked at as to, based on the number of students you had, with the -4, the 1,136,082. That's the number that you see up there in the blue. And then down below, we have a total difference from what we're gonna be receiving for regional transportation aid of $596,603. I'm on the far right of the yellow column. Oh, 546, I'm sorry, 546,603. So that 546 is then distributed between our 7 communities, based on the percentages that you see at the very bottom of the pink chart. That's this percentage. You'll see that Northborough's operating share of this budget is 6.6% this year. And it went down because you have 4 less students. Okay? The next one is OPEB Trust. That was $35,000 last year. We bumped that to $50,000 because we felt as though at $35,000 we'll never meet our liability for OPEB. So we bumped it up about $15,000. So that's shared between the 7 communities. The long-term debt service, you'll see, is that 176, which is based on the debt service schedule, which is a couple pages back. We can show you where that is, but that's what calculates that number is from the 8th debt service payment. And roughly overall, between the 7, it's down $55,000 overall. So the total assessment for the FY24 budget alone for Northborough is $1,301,581. And if you look in the pink, it shows you that's for 62 secondary students and 2 post-secondary students that are attending. Okay. Again, these assessments, the preliminary based on the House 1.
Yeah, Tony.
If, oh, go ahead.
You mentioned 62 high school students and
2 post-secondary students.
And what
So,
is that? count?
Post-secondary student is an adult student that is attending one of our programs that's an approved Chapter 74 program. That's either a practical nursing program or a cosmetology program.
And the towns pay for these students to go who are not in high school, is that?
Correct, yeah. Yeah, if they meet the criteria of a post-secondary student and we offer a program that's that way, the state will fund that or puts it through the foundation budget. If it was a postgraduate program, which means we could offer, I'll use welding because I'm familiar with it. If we offered a 60-hour welding type program, that would be a postgraduate program in which the student themselves would pay direct costs for, and it would not be assessed to the town. Yep. Yep. Okay.
Thank you.
Page 13, or any other questions? So this is, oh, sure.
Excuse me for doing this, but I do look at, okay, what's the total assessment, what's the number of students? And then do a little division. And going across the towns, the numbers vary per student cost of from 12,000 to 20,000. Why is Northborough's per student cost so much higher than every other town?
Do you want to do it, or you want me to explain it? You want me to explain it?
And this may be, I'm getting into, I don't understand how the calculation is
okay, yeah.
done.
No,
That's
this
okay.
is a good question, people to understand.
That's a great question. So actually, the range is 10,500
Between
Marlboro,
lowest, Marlboro, yep.
Marlboro, to, I gotta look at my numbers here.
I was looking, Northborough's 20, Southborough's 19.8, Westborough's 19.8, then it goes 18, 16, 17, and 12.
Right.
roughly.
Yeah, so Marlboro is the least at
Yeah.
10,500, and then, it's always a toss-up between the two, but I'm trying to think of who it is. I think the highest range is like 18 and some change, right? For our community. So it's based on, so your minimum local contribution, right, plus your, the additional required above minimum assessment, which is your busing and your OPEB, that number, you basically take that number and you divide it by the number of students that you have in the district, and that calculates your town's per pupil expenditure, if you're looking at to tie the budget that way. When we get the Chapter 70 funding, right, we get a set rate for funding per student for all 971. It's not different.
Right.
It's one set rate.
Yeah, if you look at the total
Yep.
of, 14,746 and 971 students, comes around 15,000. But you have one
Correct.
town paying 20,000 and another town paying 12.
Correct. Yeah, if you go back and look at page 7, real quick, probably a little bit more self-explanatory.
So the piece that you're looking at is the minimum local contribution that's set by the state, is their formula based on the city and town, and based on
Okay.
these, like, so if you look at page 7, it'll tell you, like, what criteria they look at in order to set those rates. It's their formula, and it comes directly to us, and they know the ability for each city and town, so that's why
The
Marlboro.
wealthier towns pay more.
Yes.
Yeah, but I'm surprised at the difference between Northborough and Southborough, for example. I would expect Southborough to be more, but I mean.
I don't know the towns around here, so I don't know who's looking for.
Well, I think it's also because
But they do.
Southborough only has 22 students.
Oh, okay.
You have 62.
Oh.
You have 64, they have 22.
Yeah.
It was interesting because
I know what you're saying, yeah.
if we were looking at Berlin and Westboro. We were looking at Berlin and Westboro, and Berlin had, no, actually it was Marlboro and Westboro. Marlboro had 49 more students, and it went up almost $500,000. Westboro only went up 9 students, and it went up $207,000. So they only had a very small portion of what Marlboro had, but they almost went up half of the cost. So it's all on the ability to pay based on the town, and what the state factors in.
And the number of students by that town, so that's how their assessment is.
It's very difficult. There are far too many variables, some of which are variables at their level. Others are variables at the formulaic level that the state provides.
Yeah.
And they're moving. Wealth factors, income factors. We had one year, I'll go back, when Elaine Kelly was the chair, we actually had someone from the state to come in to explain
Yeah.
minimum local contribution and how it all worked. And I was more confused after they left than I was before they came in to explain it.
Well, it just seems that's a huge gap.
It is a huge gap. It is a huge gap.
It's been like that for a
Again, the state determines portions of that, which is not at the discretion of the district.
Yeah.
You heard the Superintendent Martineau mention that
Yep.
last week. In fact, it's frustrating because if you remember when the regional high school came in and did their presentation, our assessment for Algonquin was going to go up 4.13%. And they were using last year's state aid numbers because the current state aid wasn't available. Now we have updated state aid numbers, which have all gone up, but our assessment has actually gone up instead of going down, because the minimum local contribution calculation has moved, requiring the town of Northborough to pay more, regardless of everything else. So it's hard to follow. There's a lot of variables, and they're at different levels. And trying to pin it on, what I always say when we focus on Assabet, because it's complicated because of all the communities that are involved, is what's the overall budget going up, and then what's our assessment doing? I mean, those are kind of the two things.
Yeah.
Is the overall budget increase reasonable? And then how does that filter down? And when we talk about our assessment is most heavily weighted by just the number of students. More students go,
Yeah.
you're gonna pay a lot more. So, I mean, it's not uncommon to see our assessments swing double digits pretty significantly based on just the number of students. But the formulaic components that build up into that, they're factors overall, but, it's the enrollment that will usually drive our assessment up or down, and your portion and your share of that overall budget. So, it's complicated to follow. It really is. For us, we mostly focus on what's happening with our enrollment.
Yeah.
How does that play out in terms of the assessment? this year, we've got two more layers of complication on top of it. You know, one of the things that Jason Little and I, the finance director, we spent probably 2 hours plus on the phone with Ernie and Maria, going over why is your budget going up 12.5%. And one of the big factor for that is, and there's a separate handout, which I don't know if it's going to help or just confuse factors more, but essentially, you know, they had out-of-district tuition. Bob, you were talking about other students, was going into a revolving fund, and they were paying they're paying portions of the budget directly out of that. They have more in-district students coming now, so that is going down. So expenses that were paid out of that are now moving into the overall operating budget. I'll try to make this as simple as we can after 2 hours of boiling it down. The 12.5% increase, about half of it roughly is just an accounting adjustment for how things are being paid for. Instead of paying it out of a revolving fund, it's moving into the operating budget, but the money is still the same. So the operating budget, we think we've got it down to the actual operating budget for Assabet is going up about 7%, just shy of 7%, if I'm not mistaken. So that's a factor. And then our assessment from year to year is another factor, which I'd like to take a moment. I don't want to cut the superintendent off, he wants to finish it. But we do have something unique that happened in fiscal '23 that's going to require a transfer in to the current fiscal year that we're in now of about $31,000 that the town of Northborough owes because of some legislation that didn't pass in terms of funding sources. This is the most complicated, but it's the most complicated budget and the most complicated estimate budget I've done in 20 years that I've been here, trying to tease all this out. There's just so many variables of motion. There is a memo from not the superintendent, a memo from the finance director that tries to kind of just give you a summary. And again, I apologize, but I think the memo's 2 pages, and I think the copy machine cut off the second page of the memo. Is there? Yeah. Let me do this. If you would give me, everybody take that memo. Let me give you a new memo. There we go. Thank you. Because it's the second page that Jason provides you. I'm going to take that. That's the new version. I apologize for that. Copy machine wasn't playing nice. Trees are taking a beating tonight.
Okay.
Okay. Your old memo, please.
I think I have both.
Yeah,
Do you have the?
yeah, you have the second page.
Does it look like that? Okay. All right, now we're all working literally off the same page. Jason, you wanna come and speak to your memo?
Oh, sure. Up our. All right, sorry to jump in the midst of your presentation, but I felt like it would be important to send this memo because the transfer that's required for the current year, FY '23 budget, hasn't come before you yet. So that having that information in front of you would be important, like in the context of hearing this presentation tonight. So if you are to compare our what we need to budget for our share of their budget in the form of our assessment, their operating assessment, if you factor the transfer in, the assessment that we'd be paying is only going up 1.74%. Whereas in our budget model, if you just look at what we voted without this transfer coming forward and being processed, it's a 4.58% increase. So that's basically the crux of the memo. And
Next week, I'll be coming forward to you to request that you approve a transfer out of the reserve fund to cover this $31,000 shortfall. And I understand it's late breaking, so you may be seeing this for the first time now.
So again, I don't think we could possibly make this any more complicated than between the state and then this last minute gyration. But again, it all ties back to the minimum local contribution formula that we have to meet. They don't have discretion, we don't have discretion. That's what we have to meet. And essentially, they were paying for a portion out of a source that the state determined could be used to contribute to our minimum local contribution. So that's why that has to happen. Let me just cut it all the way down to the bottom. Okay, we have to make this transfer because that's what we should have paid. And as Jason said, the fiscal, despite the 12.5% budget increase, which is really a 7%, and despite that, when you look at from what was appropriated at town meeting to what we're going to appropriate in '29, looks like a 4.58% increase. The bottom line is when you account for all of this, our assessment for Assabet in fiscal 2024 is going to go up 1.74%. So everybody should go, okay.
Don't ask any questions.
Okay. It's not 12.5%, it's our assessment, truly, apples to apples, when you account for all this minimum local contribution stuff that the state is backpedaling on, our assessment's going up 1.74%, which is reasonable. The rest of it, you can spend 5 more nights trying to figure out the state formula and why none of this on the surface, following the numbers, makes any sense at all. We spent, the finance director, and I know a little bit about budgeting, 2 hours of grilling these guys, asking questions and going back and forth to feel like this made sense and we were comfortable with the numbers. I'll just say to you sitting here today, it makes reasonable sense down to the level of once you get behind the formula at the state, you've lost most people. But as far as is what they're doing reasonable, does it make sense to us, and is it a reasonable assessment increase, I would say sitting here, yes. Yes, because that's really what you're all trying to get down to, is make sense of the budget increase and the assessment, and does it make sense for the town of Northborough? But there's just a lot of things that are moving around this time around that just makes it more complicated than usual. So, but I think if you read Jason's memo, what happened, just the governor said you can use this source of money to contribute towards Northborough's minimum local contribution, right? He filed legislation. The legislature did not adopt it, which means now we're all kind of in the embarrassing spot of coming back saying our minimum local contribution needs to be $31,000 more. So that's a transfer that we're going to need to make at your next meeting for the current fiscal year. Once that transfer takes place, our assessment in fiscal 2024 is going to go up 1.74%. Does that make sense? I'm just trying to keep it as simple as I can. Our assessment, like I said, year after year, is driven primarily by our enrollment, and it swings wildly. It could be up 28% because you're sending more students. It could swing down years it's gone down 10, 15%. So this year, the students aren't moving much, it's 4 less students, but the minimum local contribution's up. The net impact of all that is our assessment's going up 1.74%. That's the best I can do for you to explain the state's formula. You okay, Bob? You look perplexed.
I've been like this for years on this. I hate the idea. I feel like it's almost a shell game that's being played. Like, oh, well, we really don't know the real numbers, The state knows, but they won't tell us. They won't even help us to try to figure this out. It just bothers me that we just don't have control over what those numbers are.
Yeah, and I'll share. Let's take this conversation one step back further. I'll share with you, I chair the fiscal policy committee at the MMA, and we spent probably an hour talking about the Chapter 70 formula relative to the Student Opportunity Act. The Student Opportunity Act is diverting 70-something% of all new Chapter 70 aid, which is $468 million. So over 70% of that is going to a handful of districts. And we're not one of them. Now, from a policy standpoint, it makes sense to divert the money to the districts in need. But the reality is towns like Northborough, through this minimum local contribution formula, it's based on income and wealth factors, property values, things of that nature. We are always going to they'll look at us and say, you, Northborough, can pay more. You, Marlborough, you pay less. And that's your minimum local contribution. That's the foundation, that's the starting point for this budget. So right out of the gate, we're always gonna pay more. And then you add on the regional agreement and the other layers and how many students go. That's why it gets complicated. But we have asked the Chapter 70 formula based on the Student Opportunity Act. It's at the point where it's breaking. And the reason is most communities that are minimum aid communities like Northborough, we get $30 per student. That's it. That's what we get. So we're asking for that to be $100, but I don't want to add more complication to it. But the bottom line is we're basically a minimum aid community. We're considered to be a fairly well-off community, which means the burden is shouldered by the taxpayers in Northborough more than the state. And it filters through.
I understand that.
Yeah.
But, you know, George even picked it up on the Southborough thing. I mean, Southborough pays less. I mean, how does this formula work? We don't know.
We do know, it's just a very complicated, it's like an econometric model. There's so many variables that factor.
But that's a legitimate argument that George brought up.
Yes.
And we see it every year.
Yep.
You know, Westboro pays less. Why does Northborough always? It just, yeah, well, okay. We accept it, as long as it's not too.
We realize there's nothing we can do about it, so.
The formula doesn't make sense. I'll spare you the suspense. The formula is not fair, and it doesn't make sense. But that's the formula. But in order to fix it, the state would have to create so much chaos and winners and losers that they refuse to do that. So what they do is, instead of fixing it at its fundamental basis, they just add another layer to it.
Yeah, and then they add another.
And then the latest layer that they've sort of added is the Student Opportunity Act. And so it gets to the point where I haven't seen at this level where the minimum aid communities now, it's getting to the point where they're ready to revolt because they're not getting really any meaningful additional Chapter 70 state aid, which just means the local tax contribution keeps going up. And I'm seeing for the first time this significant divide. So if the state doesn't do something with the minimum aid per student, that $30 per student, that doesn't go somewhere between $30 and $100, people are going to revolt. Last year, the governor's budget was $30. The legislature moved it to $60. The Mass Municipal Association's lobbying for $100 per student. That would give some significant relief. It's one of the things. On Monday, we have our legislative delegation coming in. We'll be talking about our legislative priorities. That minimum local aid is one of our two top priorities, because that's the largest lion's share portion of what we get for state
But
aid.
even there, you're talking about $100 per student, and the difference in these numbers is $8,000 per student. So, I mean, it's a drop in the bucket.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what you're saying, John, is that we have the privilege of paying more since we have constructed our organization to be a more efficient possibility. In other words, we do a better job, so we can pay more.
I think that analogy goes far enough, Jan, if you have two comparable communities with similar socioeconomic demographics, but it's hard to say that Northborough and Worcester, You know, if we had, you know, the poverty and the English language learners and the issues that they have, we'd have a hard time. I'm a good manager, but I'm not that good. But to your point, yes, to some extent, the state kind of punishes towns that are well-managed because you have funding and you can afford to pay. That's really what it comes down to. They look at what they, through their formula and their variables, what they consider your ability to pay. So if you do a good job and you generate economic development, that actually hurts you. So, but- Or anyone to continue your presentation or to completely?
It all depends on what you folks want to do. We can breeze through the rest, it'll be quick. I think we were on page 13, is that correct?
Yep.
So that's just a explanation of the capital assessment, which is the eighth debt service payment. You know, we borrowed 27 million in FY16 for that renovation project that was completed. It's reducing 55,000 per year. And that was all based on a 3-year enrollment average at the time in which the project was approved. So the nice thing is, your debt service schedule, which you'll see on a couple pages back beyond this, is just going to reduce each year, and you can plan for that. The district also secured a $2 million ban, which was the difference between the total amount of the project was 29 million. We only assessed the towns 27. The district decided to take on that ban. And there's $115,200 left of that in principal and $4,000 in interest. And we're actually, this is not assessed to member communities, and we're hoping to take care of that ban in either this next budget cycle or the one after. Page 14 is basically your capital assessment. You can see it by town. You can see that your 3-year average of 6.96% will be the percentage that will be used each year in determining what your capital assessment is. And it's a reduction from the year previously of 3,828. Page 15 will actually show you the debt service schedule. Payment number 8, which is highlighted in yellow, and Northborough is the third one from the right, looking at it. You'll see the 126, 176. And you'll see as that goes down each year. Questions? Page 16, just quickly, is our operational revenue plan. You can see that in FY23, we have a FY23 and FY24. The Chapter 78 was $7,477,986. The FY24, based on the House 1 budget, $9,094,933, and you see that the change is 21.6%, which is that $1,616,947. The minimum local contribution, as we identified on that slide, MLC, when it showed you the breakdown of our towns, at that $1,136,082 under FY24 is a $6,984 dollar reduction from the year prior, which is minus 0.6%. So that's where your MLC comes from. The estimate in this revenue plan will be utilizing excess and deficiency. We increased that by $200,000 over the previous year to $500,000. The interest income, we have made some adjustments in moving our funding that's utilized through MMDT, Mass Municipal Deposit Trust, so it has a higher higher interest earning. So we can basically, we've projected that we'll be able to apply $100,000 in interest income. Medical reimbursement, $80,000, which we basically can bill back for Medicaid services that are provided to our students. And then the E-rate we utilized this year, the $15,000. We don't get a lot in E-rate, but we front-loaded using what we were going to do for some major technology upgrades this year, Wi-Fi, adding in a new backup, having a separate line actually come in from a different street, because we had both lines coming in one part of the building. And last year, we experienced for about 3 days no internet because somebody hit a pole and it took out both the lines. So as we were looking to upgrade, we said it might be smart to have the main line come in from a different area and the backup come in from where it originally was. We also increased that and added some more technology. So we won't see that again for another 3 years. So you'll see there's the line of total estimated foundation revenues for FY '24. And then below that, you'll see the state reimbursement for regional school transportation, that $99,197 increase, which brings our total for transportation this year, or FY '24, $767,086. And again, like I had mentioned, the delta that will be distributed for OPEB and busing would be in the capital assessment, right? Is down below in the member community assessments. So that member community assessments is the additional with your net busing and OPEB in the capital debt assessment. So you can see down at the bottom, the total estimated revenues, $25,288,374. Okay? The last thing, as John mentioned, as we reallocate, as we're experiencing less out-of-district coming in to offset what we used to do in the past, we thought we'd provide this slide after speaking with John and Jason about a little bit more clarity, that if you were to look at the expenditure revenue last page, which we'll see in a second, just how we're shifting some of these things. So legal services, it was in the FY '23 budget, but in FY '24, that will be paid by out-of-district tuition. The health insurance, $2 million of health insurance is going to be paid by our out-of-district tuition, but you'll see that there's a $500,000 increase on the health insurance. It goes from $143,000 to $643,000. We had $2.25 million in this FY '23 projection, but for next year, because of unknown health costs, we bumped it to $2.5 million. So $500,000 of that will remain in the budget, and the other will be paid out of district tuition. Electricity, we'll be paying out of district tuition, and then Mass State Retirement, which was paid out of district tuition this year. In the budget this year. No, excuse me. It's in out of district tuition this year is moving into the budget for next year. So as $3.5 million the year before, it dropped to $2.5 this year. As we take in less kids, it could be at $2 million or $1.5 million or $1.75 next year. It all depends on how many out-of-district kids we have to help offset those expenditures. And then the last thing that you'll see on the last slide, page 18, are our expenditures by function code. So you can kind of see where there's some swings if you look at, where was it? Insurance of active employees was what I was talking about for health insurance, $143,700. That's on, it's $5,200 on the function code. It's, that's the $500,000 that's going up to $643,700.
In the operational budget, $2 million still lies in out-of-district tuition. So $2.5 million for our health insurance.
Yep.
So that's just the one piece in operational that I'm slowly bringing back. The majority is still staying with the other funding source.
The only other thing I would say is that the expenditures that you have on that last page, John does have a copy of them more detailed, which he probably doesn't want to go through tonight, but if you were interested to see how those numbers get realized on that last page, we've provided that for you.
No questions?
Your assessment is going up 1.75%.
That's more than reasonable.
Your assessment's going up 1.75%.
I always have to pack a year, right, into this one presentation, so apologize for the length.
No, thank you, it was very helpful.
Tim, may I ask
say something?
Oh, absolutely.
Well, on behalf of Aspet Valley, John, we want to wish you well. You've been a great partner. You've been a great support. We will miss you, and we want to express our thank you for your guidance and help. Wish you the best.
Thank you, I really appreciate that.
Appreciate it.
We're going to miss you.
I may so
But
call
we
you.
have, but we have Alicia. We have her, so we won't miss you too much.
I'll come back to explain the budget next year.
And
Thank you.
And the MLC.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's Maria's. Hey, Jason. How are you?
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Next on our agenda is the Police Department fiscal year 2024 budget presentation.
That is spendthrift and haven't got anything. You might get some.
Well, the good news is I have no formulaic formulas, and if you're looking for slightly more than $3 million, and we can do that in about 10 minutes if you'd like, so.
What's our minimum local contribution for
I have
that?
no idea. 3 point,
You can get minimum local contribution. It's 3.19 million.
so.
See, that I understand.
Yeah, that, there were about 3 or 4 additional layers onto that budget that isn't in a typical year, which is difficult to understand. So that was a tough one, just trying to boil it down. It took Jason, as I said, the finance director, and myself, 2 hours on a Zoom call with them before we felt like we had a decent handle, because originally I said a 12.5% increase is just really not reasonable. Even though our assessment's only going up 1.74, if the budget was reasonable, our assessment in all likelihood should be going negative, which it has done at periods of time. And then we got into the whole accounting thing of the revolving fund. It's similar to when we budget for the fire department. You have the general fund budget, but then we have a transfer coming in from ambulance fees, and then we charge some things directly off to the revolving fund. They've been doing that for out-of-district students. Well, there was a lawsuit that they lost, that at the state level, that said you have to draw more kids from in-district. So that out-of-district pool of money in that revolving fund is going down. Those 61 students now, it's just going to go down and down and down. So they have to take what they were charging off to that revolving fund and put it in the operating budget now. And that's what's occurring, and that's going to occur for the next 3 years, as each year, it's a freshman class, the sophomore, the juniors, and the senior, it's going to phase over. So that was the big complicating factor. It took me a while to figure that out.
Mr. Chair?
Chief Liver, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. I guess, starting off with the police department operational budget, as far as any significant increases over last year's, it's fairly minimal. First, the one thing that would stick out the most is the increase to $53,037 for utilities. That's basically been calculated by facilities and John as to what we might expect. So, but, unfortunately, just 2 years ago, we did have 2 high-efficiency boilers put in under the Green Communities Act, so maybe it won't be as bad as we thought, but it's more towards electricity. $5,000 increase in a training budget, and that's basically the fact, due to the fact that we have quite a few new officers. Basically, about 2/3 of the department now has been on the job less than 5 years. And in the past year and a half, we've put on at least six officers, basically mostly under the age of 26. They need some additional supplemental follow-on training from the academy. Plus the new, under the Police Reform Act and the new post-commission guidelines, there's additional trainings and things that we have to do that are mandated, as well as some accreditation standards that we are required to train on over a 3-year period. It's a modest increase in training, but training is basically our risk management tool, so it keeps us out of trouble. Let's see. Radio line rentals went up significantly, almost doubled. That is because Verizon put us on notice several years ago that they were going to be discontinuing copper wire service and moving all to fiber optic. We have repeaters and voters around town. That's part of our communication system where the portable radios and the cruiser radios will transmit to a fixed site, like on the outskirts of town, up at Northborough Crossing, to give us communications capability in the buildings. There's several of those around town. They were always connected in the past by copper wire. That copper wire is coming down and being discontinued. So the town has migrated communications network to fiber optic, and that explains the cost. The monthly rental fees for fiber optic are significantly more expensive than copper. That would be that. Repairs and maintenance, that's actually got down because of the facilities maintenance. A significant portion of that budget was transferred over to that department now. But being the first year and unknown, there'll be some things that will pop up that we'll necessarily need to fix right away. So I requested that we keep a small amount in there for the fact that it'll probably come down again in subsequent budgets when we kind of flesh out what the costs are going to be town-wide through a single department or through the facilities budget. Vehicle maintenance, I requested a $5,000 increase. It's
Not huge.
it's economics. Nothing's cheap anymore. Labor rates are up. We are also, I don't know what to expect now that we've begun migrating to hybrid vehicles. There's not really any kind of standard maintenance schedule that I can follow. It's all new to us, so again, a modest increase in vehicle maintenance, not knowing what to expect. Field supplies up a little bit, and that's just basically due to the cost of the ever-increasing cost of ammunition, and that we're required to qualify with a certain amount of ammunition for each officer, at least a minimum of twice a year. I also have 2 officers currently in academies that when they go into the academy, they require thousands of rounds of ammunition, both handgun and rifle and shotgun, and that will basically deplete what we have on hand, so that I need to restock, so to speak, for the next year's worth of training. Those are the significant expense items. As far as other significant costs, obviously, the budget would have reflected a 2% increase, but we have had an officer on extended leave, unpaid leave, for quite a while. Sometime back, the board authorized us to backfill that position because we were shorthanded for quite a while, and it was costing a significant amount in overtime. So we have hired a replacement officer for that officer, and recently it appears that that officer will be returning. So we have to anticipate his salary coming back. And the idea is that if in the next fiscal year, after he returns, we lose any personnel or someone leaves to go to the department, we'll be stabilized back at 22 sworn officers as opposed to 23. So that would result possibly in a future decrease in the payroll. Other than that, the wages for next year through the collective bargaining agreements, dispatchers and patrol officers is settled. That's included in the budget. Sergeants have yet to settle their contract with the town, so that's going to be handled centrally through personnel. So that's again, that significant, it's a $90,000 increase to anticipate that officer's return. As far as other significant topics, we have 2 capital projects that you probably ought to be aware of, and one of them is the annual police cruiser replacement scheme that we use. This year, It will be for 3 cars. You should have had the vehicle replacement scheduled. This year would be actually, we're back on our normal 3-car replacement, and then we go back to our 2-car the next year, 3-2, 3-2. We've had a series of 3 years where it was replacing 3 cars, and that was due to the fact that during the COVID, in 21's town meeting, I believe it was, we cut my cruise request out from 2 to 1. That actually had a significant impact on the fleet. In addition to that, supply chain issues and parts for cruisers was a major issue over the last couple of years. We're just starting to see cruisers that come in now that were out of our 22 capital budget. They've been on order for over a year and a half. We received 2 of our first hybrids did I say hybrids? Hybrids, about 3 months ago. And again, that's from fiscal 22. So this brings us back up to our regular rotation. The impact was significant in that we recently replaced, the 2 new hybrids came in, and we turned over 4 vehicles that we had. 2 of them we had to keep much longer than they normally were, and they were in pretty rough shape. They took a beating. They were well over 140,000 miles, and one of them I just sidelined because it was going to need about $2,800 worth of repairs, and it had 138,000 miles on it, and so we traded that in towards these other cars. So, that's that, and the one that I'm really happy to see is the capital plan for repairing and painting or staining the outside of the police station. I don't have to tell you, I'm embarrassed by the appearance of that building. Again, victim of COVID and a couple of other things. That originally, the plan was to have the Sheriff's Department, Community Service Program, pre-release folks to do the building. They did it the last time. It was stained on the inside and painted on the outside. Minimal dollars. It was cost of materials and the rental of a little skylift for a few days. They have shut down that program back in when COVID's first started, due to the fact that it's a closed community, and they didn't want people going out into the community potentially being exposed to COVID, bringing it back in to the population. As of about a month ago, I called up there again. They are still not doing it, and even if they were, the response I got was they would barely have enough people to fulfill it if they had qualified people there. There's a criteria you got to meet to be able to go out to the community. So that's moving forward. It's just the project has to be done. There's a lot of rotted clapboards on the building. Some of the fascia boards need to be replaced with composite board. It's a 33-year-old wood frame building with wood clapboards on it. So it's in desperate need of a paint job and some repair. And that's basically what this is for. And that is basically, unless you have some questions of me, our budget in a nutshell. Yes, sir.
You're going to a lot of electric vehicles now.
What's that?
You're going to a lot of electric vehicles now, the hybrids, and
Well, all of our marked patrol vehicles will be hybrids moving forward.
so when our electric grid goes down, what are the plans to move the officers around?
They're hybrids.
Those are hybrids, not all electric.
It's not all electric.
Most of them now, you still have to plug them in.
No, you don't.
There's very few that,
No, not the police patrol vehicles.
Okay.
Now, some of them you do plug in because they may have extended life batteries, like, you might be able to, they say you get like 45 miles out of a full charge, but it's a supplemental thing. But no, these cars don't plug in. These have regular gasoline engines that, when they're running, charge the batteries in the car.
Yep.
They're like about 1,500 pounds heavier than a regular Ford Explorer because of the battery deck underneath. The only a couple of drawbacks I've heard about that is police departments have experienced greater and faster tire wear because of the extra weight on the vehicle. But when you step on the brakes, things like that, and the engine's running, it charges the batteries. You stop at a red light, the engine stops. You can actually drive at a low speed, and it will drive on electric power until it decides it needs a charge, and the engine will start. The first time I drove one, it was kind of a freaky experience because I started the car and nothing happened. I put it in drive and took my foot off the brake, and it started driving. And it actually went for quite a distance before the engine started, so. I can tell you that we have noticed a fuel difference already. We track mileage and fuel gallons, and on the two cars, we've seen about and we've only had them for just about a month, and at a first blush, when I looked at the numbers, it looks like about almost a 50% reduction in fuel costs, or consumption, I should say, not cost. So that's promising. There are no, I'll tell you right up front, I'm sure I'll get some questions perhaps, Tom, but there are no full electric, police patrol rated electric vehicles. There are no manufacturers that will stand behind it. I have spoken to chiefs that we're going to go all electric, and I spoke to one in particular that was referenced at the town meeting, and basically said that the plan to go to all electric ended with the first one that they bought. And it's, they said they have to keep it inside because if it's left outside when it's used in patrol, it immediately loses about 50% of its charge. And there's no such thing as a rapid change battery. So, and some of the police fleet magazines that are out there, and periodicals, basically state that in order to actually maintain your fleet and have cars ready for the following shifts, it's almost a 2-to-1 replacement of gas, electric to gas. So that's, the technology is still a bit off, not to mention the infrastructure is just not there, as you said. So that's it on the hybrids. They actually drive very well, and so the guys like them, gals too. So personally, I'm still a Dodge Charger kind of guy.
Yeah.
Just from what I read in the papers, they're centralizing the dispatchers, but Northborough decided not to get in on that. I was wondering what our thinking was behind that.
Well, I'd like to say that the thinking on that would be, let's wait and see how that works before we join, because once we lose our 911 system at the station, you'll never get it back unless you want to pay upwards of $1 million. State 911 is trying to consolidate PSAPs. It's all a money-saving issue. So they're encouraging it. They're basically flaunting money in front of towns to go regional, but that's there's a pay down on that, and eventually we would pay to be a member of that organization, and you lose local control. So I am not a fan of it. I've talked to a lot of chiefs that haven't. They wish they never did it. But that's a conversation for another time. So I don't think the decision was made not to do it. I mean, there were discussions, and we've looked into it. I've attended the meetings. So I would never say that it's totally.
Well, I thought it was a good idea that we didn't get into it. I just saw the money going the wrong way on that. But
Well, it depends on how it's how the system is designed. You know, if it's done on a legislative created specific subdivision type of its own entity, or if you just do an intermunicipal agreement where one town is the host, that town gets the lion's share of the money, and after 3 or 4 years, State 911 would stop paying the town the incentive money, and we start paying that community. And I'm a firm believer in the old adage that, you know, possession is 9/10 of the law. So you tend to lose a lot of control on that. So
I just wanted to add one thing on the police cars.
yes.
On the new cars. I think one thing that I've learned as I've been involved in this, I think it's important for people to know, is it's not necessarily the miles on the cars, it's how they're running for, what, 15, 20 hours a day, the police cars?
Well, the maximum would be with the number, we try to manage the fleet with the number of cars that we have so that it eliminates them being on the road 24 hours a day. So it's constructed now so that no car is on the road more than 16 hours.
But they're running the whole time, even when they may have 130,000 miles on them, but they may
The
have,
rule of thumb on the fleet management is you can add 25 to 30% more mileage based on idle time.
Yeah.
So if you add 25% to what the odometer says, and that's actually what you've got for, because they are constantly idling. You
Yeah.
can't shut them off on the side of the road because batteries go dead rapidly because there's so many electrical components in there.
yeah.
There's computers, thermal printers for citations. It's just, there's a heavy electrical load.
Yeah. I just think that that's important for residents if they're watching tonight.
I'd also like to point out that while the costs look expensive, the costs for the actual vehicles under the contracts and the state bids and the competitive bids out there are minimal, what we pay for cars. But the cost is in the upfit, putting the radios in the cars, putting lights,
Yeah.
all of this. Every now and then, there's scheduled obsolescence. Ford will, like with the new hybrids, they're 11 inches wider than the previous Ford Explorers that we had. So the cages and the seats, the inserts in the back seats don't fit, so we have to buy all the seats and cages. And so there's quite a bit of an expense with the car.
Thank you, Chief.
Okay, great, thank you. Thank you.
Next on our agenda is the Planning Director, a project update on downtown revitalization, economic development, and MBTA zoning.
Hello.
How are you?
Thank you for having me. My name is Laurie Connors, so I'm the planning director. Just hit my 1-year anniversary, so I'm excited about that.
Happy anniversary.
Thank you.
Possible. And you're still here.
I'm still here and enjoying it. So I am not going to focus on finances at all this evening, maybe a little bit, but for the most part, I understand that you folks are interested in updates on economic development activities, downtown revitalization, as well as the MBTA affordable housing effort. So I thought that I would start with the easiest, and that is the development update. So I provided you with essentially a list divided into institutional, industrial, commercial, and residential development. So what you can see here, actually, I do have an update. The planning board last night approved site plan approval for the Algonquin High School playing fields project. So that is fresh off the press that was approved. They wanted to make it clear that their approval had nothing to do with the material of the playing fields. It was pretty much the layout and the construction of the improvements. So the hot topics in industrial commercial, we do have a 150,000 square foot warehouse for 0 and 301 Bartlett Street. That was originally denied by the planning board. The applicant appealed the decision. It's been going through the appeal process for the last couple of years, and it was ultimately remanded back to the planning board. So we are in public hearing right now, trying to work out the particulars of conditions of approval. So hopefully that'll wrap up in the next couple of weeks. Some other notable projects are 200 Bartlett Street. That was essentially a major renovation and change of use of existing structures. 100 Barefoot Road was 2 large building additions of approximately 26,000 square feet. And so those are pretty much the most significant projects that have been permitted over the last year since I've been here. On the residential front, there's very little happening. Pretty much the development that we're seeing these days is single-family development along existing ways. So there was one subdivision. It was approved a number of years ago. They are wrapping up construction. We were thinking that they were going to be ready for acceptance of the town road this year, but there were some issues with ponding, which is going to knock it off for another year. So we have only permitted 1 duplex. Last 7 years, the number of new residential units has been very small, less than 20 per year. averaging about 10 units in the last few years. So, anybody have any questions about what I just went over? No? Okay, so now we're going to move on to downtown revitalization. So this is an exciting project. So I've been working with the Master Plan Implementation Committee on this. So you may recall at last year's town meeting, $150,000 was allocated towards the creation of pretty much a downtown revitalization plan and a visioning effort. After we went through the procurement process, we ended up hiring a consultant team that is led by Weston and Sampson engineers. So the project kickoff was in October. And since that time, we've really been, of course, they've been doing a lot of data gathering, but we've also been focusing on public outreach and trying to determine what people want for the downtown. So the first effort in that regard was a survey that was distributed at Applefest, and it was also online. So we got, that survey was open for a couple of months. I think it closed the beginning of December, and we received a pretty good response rate, over 600 responses. And so then we used the information gathered through the survey in order to plan a couple of community visioning exercises. So the first one was held in January. I think it was January 27th, if I remember correctly. It was held at the high school library, and it was very well attended. In my best dreams, I was hoping for 50 people, and we ended up getting between 70 and 80 people. In fact, we ran out of handouts. So we got some fantastic feedback. That event was focused on breaking out the downtown into 4 distinct areas and asking people what they would like to see in each of those areas. So they were given a variety of stickers, so they could put, you know, outdoor eating or brewery or, you know, pocket park or, you know, seating. So there were a whole bunch of different stickers, different uses, and different streetscape improvements that people could essentially vote on. And all of that was aggregated together into a kind of summary of what people want for each area, and I provided that to you in a little PowerPoint presentation. So then that community outreach session was followed up with another one, much smaller one, 7 a.m. at the public library on a Tuesday afternoon. And we hand-delivered invitations to every single business within the area. And we had about 15 people come. And that was more of a, like, brainstorming, give us your opinion, kind of. The consultant had a list of questions, and they provided feedback. And they also filled out a survey. So what Weston and Sampson is doing now is they are coming up with redevelopment scenarios. So they're going to present to the Master Plan Implementation Committee like 4 different redevelopment scenarios. And then the committee is going to give them some feedback, and then we're going to have another community outreach event where those scenarios are going to be presented, and we're going to ask people what they think about them. And that's going to lead into one preferred redevelopment scenario. And that's going to be presented at the final workshop. So it's kind of a fun process where people can kind of re-envision completely what they would like to see. So if an atomic bomb came down into Northborough Center, and you could start fresh, what would you like to see in these various areas? So, so we envision, part of this project does include a traffic study. So we engaged Central Mass Regional Planning to do some traffic counts at 3 intersections along Route 20, because there is interest in possibly narrowing the travel lanes of Route 20 in order to make the downtown more pedestrian friendly. So one of the things that has come out loud and clear in the survey and in the community exercises is that people don't really come downtown because it's not welcoming. They don't feel like they can walk from place to place. Parking is a big problem. So one of the things that Weston and Sampson is looking at is whether we can bring back on-street parking in certain locations. So we'll see what happens. They're in the midst of that effort. So everything should pretty much wrap up in May. So at that time, we will get a report. There will be a final presentation that will be given to a joint meeting of the Board of Selectmen and the Master Plan Implementation Committee. And of course, that will be on Zoom and it'll be televised. And we will be creating a web page that has all of this information on it. Yes?
I'm just thinking about the timing kind of thing, because you said this is all going to wrap up in May. But you
Yes.
mentioned, okay, coming up with 4 scenarios, presenting it to the implementation committee, then coming back and presenting it publicly, et cetera. May's only 60 days away.
Yeah, it's really close. Yep, you are absolutely right. And we will find out more. So actually, we have a master plan implementation committee meeting scheduled for next Thursday. So at that time, we're going to be discussing the timing of the next 2 community workshops. And there was a bit of a holdup with the traffic counts, which ended up delaying the project. So originally, we were supposed to be done early May, like May 1st. But now it may be a month or so later, so we're not exactly sure. So we're waiting to see. And of course, those meetings are online, they're on Zoom, so if you're interested in tuning in. So once all of this process is done, then what I envision is that there will be a phase 1 project that will come out of this. And that will be a construction project. And the goal of the phase 1 project will be to do infrastructure improvements. So part of the downtown revitalization effort will involve zoning changes, and that'll primarily affect private property. But what does the town have control over? We have control over the public realm. So pretty much that's the roadways, the right-of-ways, the sidewalks. And so that's where we really have potential to make a difference. And of course, there are various municipal properties in the downtown that will be changing over soon and have potential for redevelopment. So I envision that a phase 1 project, so a reasonable scope of a project, in my opinion, is about a $2 million project. And believe it or not, $2 million doesn't go very far when we're talking about infrastructure. So the engineering costs associated with designing a $2 million project are probably in the realm of $200,000 to $250,000. So that is likely what we will need for phase 1 project. The first year would be a design exercise. And then during the design exercise, if there is seed money available, then I envision applying for grants to pay for the construction of the infrastructure improvements. I envision that it would kind of be a patchwork of a variety of grants, one of which would be a complete streets grant. And it is likely that the construction process will take about 9 months to complete. So when you complete the design, you go out to bid. That process usually takes 2 to 3 months to actually reach contract. And then, of course, we're limited by the construction season, which generally starts April 15th and ends December 1st. So that's when the work has to take place. So 2 years for each phase is what I'm envisioning. But the progress on downtown revitalization, of course, has to do with money and the availability of it. So the period of time that it'll take to complete a downtown revitalization project may vary, depending upon money. So if all things being perfect, I envision each phase would take 2 years. So when you're constructing phase 1, you'd be in design for phase 2. So you could potentially do that 2 phases within a 3-year interval, but that would be super, super ambitious. So I don't think that that's really likely to happen. So that's kind of the timeline that I'm thinking. And of course, any sort of project that involves improvements to Route 20 would have to involve Mass DOT, and it would also need to involve Central Mass Regional Planning, because the project would have to be placed on the TIP, the Transportation Improvement Plan, and they, of course, that is a competitive process. So there are 40 communities within the Central Mass Regional Planning area. So we would be competing against 40 other communities who also want infrastructure improvements. So it can take a number of years to get improvements to Route 20 on a tip. So I just want to be realistic about the time frame for Route 20 improvements. It would be much easier for us to tackle side streets than it will be for us to tackle Route 20. So does anybody have any questions about that?
I just see this taking quite a bit longer than they're thinking about, just because it is Route 20 and a state road. It takes a dozen years just to put in a traffic light. You have to have so many people drop dead from that to even get a light in. They have narrow roads and parking and whatever else they're thinking of doing. I don't see the state coming through too fast.
Yeah, it can definitely take a long time. I don't know, John, were you here for the last
Yes, I
Route
was.
20?
Yeah, so we actually got, I actually went to the Central Mass Regional Planning. We got our project on the Transportation Improvement Plan. That's a TIP that you refer to. So it was around 2013 to 2015. It's a little over a $5 million project. That's when we did the whole downtown. At that time, we looked at all different scenarios. We looked at rotaries. We looked at reconfiguring how Church Street lines up with Monroe. We looked at taking property by eminent domain. We looked at all those things, and ultimately, at the time, the costs were prohibitively expensive. And what we wound up doing was the town engaged its own engineering firm to do the design so that we can then get it through the funding through the TIP. But that's when you saw things like the turning lanes added on Church Street, turning lanes, the light added on Hudson Street, the synchronization of all the lights. I'll just, for the record, folks always say, oh, synchronization, they're always out of sync. I'm sitting here I'm on a green light, but the traffic's here, and it's the red light up ahead, and they're all supposed to be green at the same time. The reason for that is they are all synchronized, and they do work in coordination, so that in an ideal world, when you're driving down, all 3 lights are green, or the traffic is all moving together. What happens is every time somebody presses the walk button, it throws the cycle off for about five minutes or so. And so anytime anybody's walking in the downtown hitting the button, that's why you'll see, it seems like it doesn't work as well. as it could. But the bottom line was, you know, when you're working within the footprint of what you have, unless you're going to spend a lot of money doing takings and so forth and reconfiguration, the project at the time focused on really traffic flow and safety, really safety, pedestrian safety and motorist safety, getting turning lanes so traffic can continue to move without people getting stuck behind somebody waiting to turn left on Hudson Street. So yeah, it was a great project. We also had the new walkways in with the stamped red concrete. It's funny, as I go down through the downtown, I'm like, we just did this project, but it was, 10 years ago plus, so it goes by. But there were a lot of great improvements that were made that improved the flow of the downtown, and really just the safety, particularly for pedestrians.
The good thing about that time period when those improvements were made to Northborough Center versus today is that Mass DOT recognizes that in the past they've always been mostly concerned about moving automobile traffic as efficiently as possible and really haven't cared about anything else. So they haven't really cared about pedestrians, they haven't really cared about bicyclists. And so everything, particularly Northborough's downtown, is auto-dependent. And now they recognize that that's not the best way to build downtowns, and that pedestrians are just as important to the health of a downtown as automobiles are. And so now they're trying to level the playing field. So Mass DOT recognizes this. So originally, the conversation we had is, well, those improvements were done like less than 10 years ago. There's no way they're going to approve a TIP project to change things in downtown when it was done so recently. But we're hoping that because of their shift in understanding about how to make successful downtowns, we will be able to convince them to maybe move things around a little bit. So the next topic, I was hoping.
Actually, one more question on
Oh,
this.
yeah.
And a couple points, you mentioned the ARPA funds, and is the Master Plan Implementation Committee anticipating that they're going to get ARPA funds, and has it been discussed how much they're anticipating getting? I mean, it's even referenced that, this construction schedule coincides well with ARPA funding schedule, which mandates ARPA funds must be fully expended by December 31st, 2026. So they're already lining up the ARPA funds and the expenditures. So I was just wondering if.
Yes, of course, I've talked to John about this quite a bit. It is hard to know what a phase one project will be when we're in the middle of this visioning exercise. But based on past experience, because in the community I just left, I was in the process of doing a downtown revitalization project. So I already have experience with doing a phase one and a phase two project and the costs associated with that. So even though it's very early in the process, I wanted to make it known that I, and certainly the Master Plan Implementation Committee, are interested in ARPA funds, particularly for the phase one engineering. So the timing of a lot of the grants, they would pay for design services. Those grants are due on June 2nd. So it doesn't meet up very well with the completion of our visioning exercise. So I don't want to wait another whole year to get design money, but ARPA money is available. So
How many are you looking for design?
I would love between 200 and 250 for design.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's what the master plan would be looking for from ARPA funds, is the 250?
Well, we haven't discussed a particular number. They have asked for my suggestion, and that is the suggestion that I provided. So we haven't yet identified a phase one project. It's
Right.
too premature. But Weston and Sampson will be super helpful in helping us identify what could be a project that's approximately $2 million. And the design is typically 10% of the construction costs. So that's where I'm getting those numbers. So so I mentioned grant writing. So in my experience in my prior town, I was able to rely on municipal funds to cover about 27% of the project costs, and then the balance were all grants. Now, Northborough is a wealthier community, and isn't as hard up in certain areas. Like, for example, that downtown was an environmental justice area due to low income population. Northborough Center doesn't have that, although we do certainly have quite a bit of affordable housing in the downtown. So that's good. So I'm not sure how much grant money I'll be able to get. But at an absolute minimum, I'm gonna need for a $2 million project, at least 500 grand. It may be more than that. It may be as much as $1 million.
In addition to the 250.
Correct. So if a couple of different options, so if we have a proposed $2 million project and we are unable to secure $2 million in funding, then we just scale back the project, and that's most likely what would happen. Or I come to you and I say, hey, instead of asking for 500 grand, now I'm asking for $1 million. And then that would be up to town meeting and certainly your support, whether that were to happen.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Just by way of timing, just so people are clear, so we were talking about the American Rescue Plan Act funding needs to be committed by 2024, fully expended by December of 2026, if I'm not mistaken. And so this downtown vision and long-term project, this is something that's going to be 5-10 years, different phases. What we're talking about here is phase one. Phase one might get off within the time frame of ARPA, but the balance of the phases 2, 3, however many phases after that, probably they're not going to be done in time for ARPA. So we're talking about, if anything, potentially design and some matching or contributing portion of construction for some to be determined phase one project. But you're not going to be able to use ARPA funds for phase 2 and 3, right, just because the requirements to commit and expend the funds it'll be tight to get that for phase 1. So just so people are clear on that.
So in your packet, so originally I was hoping to give you a PowerPoint presentation on the wall, and I have my laptop there, but I forgot the cord, the charging cord. So I just checked my battery and it was about to die. So we're gonna have to make do with the paper copy. So if you just bear with me. So the next topic that I wanted to talk to you about is the MBTA compliance. So a little bit of background information about why we have to deal with this is because of the Massachusetts housing crisis. So that has driven housing prices to an astronomical level and an unsustainable level, particularly within the Route 495 Beltway. So of course, this is no surprise to anybody. So the state leaders have been particularly concerned because they feel that the lack of housing development statewide means that Massachusetts is at a competitive disadvantage to other states when it comes to recruiting new business and job development. So they recognize that municipalities have a lot of power to create housing. And the way they do that is through zoning, mostly. So that is why this change in Mass General Law, Chapter 40A, has come into play. So a little bit of background about Chapter 40A, Section 3A. So although the Economic Development Bill has included a number of changes that impact housing production in Massachusetts, tonight I'm only going to focus on the changes to Section A. So what this requires is MBTA communities to adopt zoning district allowing multifamily housing to be constructed by right. So typically, most communities set up a special permitting process for multifamily development. So what that means is that planning boards or zoning board of appeals have the power to turn down a development if they don't like it, if they feel that there are too many impacts to abutters. But if it's a by right approval process, then that power is stripped away. So they still can require site plan review. So that's looking at landscaping and lighting and road layout and the number of units and the design of buildings. And so the planning board still has a lot of power over the design of a development, but as long as a developer complies with the regulations, then the planning board has to approve it. It's not a discretionary approval. So that is really the big difference. So we are in good company. There are 175 municipalities in total that are subject to the new law. So Northborough is classified as an MBTA adjacent community. So what that means is that we don't have a transit station within our community, but we are adjacent to a community that has a transit station. So that's why we are adjacent. So the law requires each MBTA community to have a district of reasonable size in which at least 15 units per acre are permitted as of right, although the development, like I said, may be subject to site plan review. So they define reasonable size as an area containing 50 acres. So it can be an overlay district, and it can be broken up into different sections of town, but you need to have one area that has at least 25 contiguous acres, and no area can have less than 5 contiguous acres. So it's a little bit confusing in that way. So the next slide shows a variety of different examples of what 15 units per acre looks like. An important thing about this overlay district is that it allows a whole host of different types of housing. So you can have single-family homes in there, you can have duplexes, townhouses, you can have garden-style apartments, and you can have mixed use. So commercial on the first floor and apartments above. And you can also have different densities in different areas. So if you end up having 3 different locations within the multifamily overlay district, one of those locations can be at a density of, say, 11 units per acre. And then another area could be at a density of 20 units per acre. But when you average it all out, it has to equal 15 units per acre. So that's the trick. And then also another interesting aspect of the law is that you don't have to just zone an area that's vacant land. So you can include already existing development within your designated area. So for example, One of the areas that we're exploring is Avalon. So right now, the Avalon development has 382 multifamily units spread over 42 acres. So that equals a density of 9 units per acre. So if we were to include Avalon in our area, or at least a portion of that, then they may be able to get additional units by including them within this district. So then the planning board is also exploring another area, 333 Southwest Cutoff. So I'm sure everybody knows where that is. That's the New England Baseball Complex. So the town was approached by the owner of that facility because he's no longer interested in continuing with the baseball. Now he wants to do luxury apartments. So that is a 29-acre area. So that would get us nearly to where we need to be. And they are willing to enter into a development agreement with the town. So the interesting thing about a development agreement is you can negotiate certain things about the number of units and the amenities and off-site improvements that would not be required by the by right zoning. So it could be a negotiation saying that, hey, you enter into this development agreement with us, then we agree that we'll include you within our overlay district. So it ends up being a win-win. So that's something that we're looking at. No guarantees as of yet. So a third option that we're looking at is land within Northborough Center. So that is intriguing because it would support our downtown revitalization efforts. So the history of long-term commercial vacancies in Northborough Center indicates that there is insufficient demand to support a large number of businesses in this area. But if we add some additional housing units within walking distance of our downtown, then we can increase the market demand for business. So if we were to have, the retail on the first floor, and then we have the apartments above, then of course the people who live in the apartments are going to patronize the downtown businesses. And that's going to make the businesses more successful and likely increase the number of businesses we have downtown that are successful. So the other interesting thing is we have some underutilized buildings downtown that could be converted into housing. So one that we have discussed is certainly this building right here. So if the town hall were to move back to its original location, then this building will be surplus and the opportunity exists for it to be housing. Another property, of course, I'm sure you've heard about Metro West's proposal for affordable housing at White Cliffs. So that's another opportunity. And this housing, like I said, would support the economic vitality. We'd have more, life after 5 o'clock, which would be great. Yeah.
How many units do we need to add?
So the way it works is you're supposed to demonstrate that you can accommodate up to 750 units. So what they did is they take 50 units and they times it by, 50 acres times it by 15 units per acre, and that ends up being 750 units. Now, one of the benefits of selecting areas that are unlikely to turn over quickly, like these downtown locations that I'm talking about, like this town hall, we could include the Mill Building on Hudson Street, is it's unlikely that that housing is going to be produced in the near term. if the southwest cutoff property is included, chances are that will be developed in the short term, within the next 5-6 years or so. Avalon, of course, is already largely developed. There may not be any additional units that are added to that development. We
Does
just have
Avalon
to,
count against the 750?
yes, it does.
So the
if that,
392, whatever the number was, 750 minus that 400 means we need to add an additional 350 units.
so we wouldn't include all of Avalon. So if we included the 29 acres at Southwest Cutoff, and then we wanted to include 20 acres of Avalon, then that's how it would factor out. So then you wouldn't get the risk of having a huge number of additional units at Avalon. It'd be watered down. But let me continue, because there's a point I want to make a couple of slides ahead. So determining the suitability for families and children. So that's one of the caveats to this program is communities for many years have been writing their zoning in such a way that is not welcoming to families. They want to have senior citizens, exactly. They limit all multifamilies to two-bedroom units or studios or one-bedroom units, so nobody can have children. And the state said, nope, we're on to you. We're not going to let you do that. So they are prohibiting bylaws that restrict the size of the units, the number of bedrooms, the size of the bedrooms, and the number of occupants. So this bylaw does actually have to be approved by the state. So there is a stick associated with it. So the next slide after that talks about affordability. There is no mandate to include affordable housing in this multifamily district. However, as you know, Northborough is 40B compliant, which means that more than 10% of the total number of housing units in Northborough are restricted to low-income or moderate-income households. So that is great, and we don't want to lose that percentage, that compliance. So it would likely be prudent for our bylaw to require at least 10% of the units created to be affordable to lower moderate income folks. So
If I could just chime in, I'm sure people sitting here wondering, well, where the heck are all those units? Well, it was under the 40B. Under 40B, it's a unique law in that when Avalon Bay went in, 382 units, 20% are affordable. Under the law, all 382 units count towards our affordable housing stock. That's how we got to about 11%. So we're over that 10%. That's how we did it. And in fact, that was part of the whole discussion of allowing that level of density to be developed in that area of town was to get us out from under the 40B statute. If we didn't have that, if we weren't at our 10% or above, it means a developer can come in, override your local zoning. That's when you have high-density housing condominiums being put into what would otherwise be single-family neighborhoods, which was getting everybody all upset. So we're in a position now, because of the Avalon Bay development, of being able to do what are called friendly 40Bs, like we did in the downtown. The old two properties from the Trinity Church, we worked with Habitat for Humanity, Assabet, restored the historic buildings, created several units of affordable housing. It was a win all around. We can do that, but we can't be forced to do it anymore. But the only way you were ever going to get there, can you imagine if you had to build houses or duplexes or condominiums to get to that number, 382? It's just a fluke in the way the statute was written, that all the apartments count, even though only 20% are basically subsidized affordable housing. So that's the magic.
So the next slide, one thing I wanted to make clear is this is not a mandate to create any multifamily units. So the state is saying that you have to change your zoning bylaws to allow the multifamily units by right. But if not a single one is created, that's okay. So it's pretty much a zoning exercise. So if you think about the town, of course, the town is divided into zoning districts. I understand that the industrial district was created in the 1960s. And that wasn't built out until just recently, the last 10, 20 years. So the same is true of our residential areas that are, there is the possibility of, you know, hundreds of additional units. Like if the farms were to be sold, those could be developed into subdivisions or multifamily complexes or whatever. So there's always the potential to build wherever you are in town. And so this is no different. You're just creating the potential. So next one, so what are the consequences if Northborough does not comply? So there are a number of communities around the state who have just said, nope, you know, we're not going to allow the state to tell us what to do, so we're just not going to do it. So what is the hammer? And there is a hammer. And the hammer is that we will no longer be eligible to apply for certain state grants. The most important being the MassWorks Infrastructure Program and the Housing Choice Initiative. So these are two grant programs that I have successfully received in the past for downtown revitalization activities. So these are ones that I really want to maintain access to in order to make the downtown revitalization project actually happen. And we're also eyeing the MassWorks Infrastructure Program as a vehicle for extending sewer service to Route 9. So there are a number of properties, the Motel 6, and there's a restaurant next door, whose name I can't remember. Yep. That are currently suffering from failing septic systems. And so it would be good for Route 9 if sewer could be brought down. So one of the great things about the MassWorks Infrastructure Program is if a project is shovel-ready, meaning it's fully designed and permitted, then they will pay the construction costs, which can be super, super, you know, hefty. So I had received that MassWorks grant in the past for another community, and they gave us $2.2 million to extend sewer to a project. It was very similar to this scenario where you had failing septic systems and an underperforming shopping center. So I'm going to put it out there. I would like to comply.
These clubs or these sticks are a big deal to us, where maybe other communities would say, I don't care. We care.
Exactly. I mean, there are some communities that are so wealthy that they don't need grant money. And so they're in a circumstance where they can just say, you know, I don't care.
I've been reading some of that in the Globe. There's been some articles about communities saying, we're not going to do this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and there are some small towns that might be in the same position. They don't have the professional staff to apply for grants anyway, so they don't care.
But you also have to offset the cost of having whatever 700 new units in here.
Right.
Yeah.
How many of those? How many the 700 units? How many? Two kids a unit. That's 1,400 kids.
Exactly.
13,000, 15,000 bucks a kid. I mean, you're talking millions and millions of dollars per year.
The other
To
issue we've
lose
talked about
access to
too
these
is
grants is.
that density up by Avalon Bay, if the ball fields were to be developed, that'll push that over to where the police department's gonna want that to be its own patrol district. So that's 3 more officers, 3 more cars. So there is,
What's that gonna do to Proctor?
but there is a lot to be, it all needs to be weighed. It all needs to be weighed.
Yeah, and also, I mean, that's part of the planning process. So part of what I've been thinking about is identifying those properties that are unlikely to turn over. So like the Avalon. Well, the Avalon's already mostly developed, so what's the impact gonna be? Probably nothing. There's probably not gonna be any additional units in Avalon. There might be a few, but, I mean, they've got some topography considerations that really are limiting. And then, of course, this building's not turning over for a certain number of years. The mill building, well, they just got permitted for a massive renovation. That building's not turning over. So it's important to include a variety of different types of land. So developed land unlikely to be developed in the near future, and then land that is available for development. And the other good thing is the town is barely creating any housing on a year-to-year basis over the last 7 years. Like I said, it's been less than 20 units per year, so it's a very small number. So that's pretty much it. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right, on the compliance timeline, the action plan submission was the end of January?
Yes.
And we submitted an action plan, or?
We did. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I didn't finish this presentation. Sorry about that. Yeah, so I submitted the action plan. It's in your packet.
Okay.
So that was done by the deadline. Our next deadline is December 31st, 2024. We are aiming for town meeting next year to put forth a bylaw. And the good thing about going for the April 2024 town meeting is that if it were to fail at town meeting, then we still would have some time to make some tweaks and then try again at a special town meeting in the fall. So then, right now, we are working with Judy Barrett of the Barrett Planning Group on our compliance. So she's helping us pin down the various areas that we want to include within an overlay district and evaluate them against the criteria that the state is mandating that we use to ensure that they will comply. And then if we still need help after her stint is done with us, then Central Mass Regional Planning also has technical assistance available to us that we can avail ourselves of. So our planning board meeting on March 21st will be our kickoff meeting with Judy Barrett. So if you're interested, she's scheduled for 6 p.m. that night. She's going to be with us for about an hour that night. So she'll be giving us a presentation, and she'll be sharing some preliminary analysis that she's done of that Southwest Cutoff property and Avalon. So, anybody else?
Again, the possibility that there'll be a certain amount of intersection between this and our downtown revitalization is there.
Yes.
Right, okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, I really do think that some amount of housing is necessary to make the downtown revitalization work.
Okay.
Yeah, so when you look at any other, like, I grew up just outside of Boston, and downtown Boston, the South End, where I grew up just down the street, the Lower Mills area, all of that revitalization was spurred by housing in those locations to create the demand.
Okay.
All right?
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our Next meeting is March 15th, 2023. I assume at 7 PM.
Yes, will be, fire department will be coming in, as well as Jason will be back with those transfers that we started to talk about this evening, out of the reserve account. And then I'm not sure if we'll have an update from, at least a memo from probably the superintendent, now that he's got some state aid numbers, because they have, as I said, the assessment that he presented at a prior meeting is now modified based on that.
Any other business? Motion to adjourn? Motion and seconded.
I'm giving Janice the motion and George the second.
Simultaneously.
All those in favor? Anybody opposed?
9:26.
We are adjourned. Thank you very much.
Tired.